Okay, so the next thing we need to understand is to understand why this persecution and this anti-Semitism became so exaggerated in Germany by the 1930s. To understand that, we have to understand a little bit about the context of Germany itself, okay? So, after Germany surrendered at the end of the First World War, Germany had to accept a really strict peace treaty. Now, this peace treaty was signed at the Palace of Versailles in France, which is where I'm sat right now. As they were the losers of the war, they weren't really given any rights to negotiate and were pretty much forced just to sign the document or be invaded by the Allies, the Britain, France, and America. The treaty completely bankrupted Germany, and it forced them to pay huge sums of money as reparations, and that word means payments. Okay, so they had to make huge payments to America, Great Britain, and France. This money was actually $6.6 billion, so you can understand why Germany became bankrupt. People were starving and lots of people began to lose their jobs or become unemployed. So unemployed is the word we use for losing your job. By 1933, 1 in 3 Germans were unemployed, which was around 6.1 million people. So what you need to take from that is that in Germany at this time, we have lots and lots of poverty and we have lots of unemployment. So people are really unhappy at the conditions they live in. So all of these people are really angry and unhappy. And when Hitler comes to power, he had to find someone to blame this on, to blame this crisis on. He used all this anger that people felt and began to try and improve it. And at the same time, he blamed what had happened on the Jews in Germany. He said they had betrayed the country and were the cause of the economic instability, so the economic problems that people had felt. Once he was in power by 1934, he then started to persecute. So that word means to directly target and make life difficult for them, Jews living in Germany and in German territory using laws. So hopefully you're sitting there thinking, okay, so I kind of get it now. Things are really difficult. Lots of people were living in really high levels of poverty and were starving and didn't have very much. And somebody comes along and says, this is all the fault of the Jewish people. I see how that connection can be made and how in that situation, lots of people might have believed it because they didn't really know what else to believe or who to blame it on. So within that world, Hitler also uses something else to try to cement this view in people's heads. And that was a thing we call propaganda. Now, propaganda means information that's often biased, so from one perspective or one point of view. And this information is used to promote somebody else's political cause or their point of view. So if I wanted you to think I was the best teacher in the world and should be given or made prime minister of the whole country because I was so good at teaching, I might make you posters and leaflets and send your parents emails spreading this message. And if you had me for 10 years as your teacher, from when you were a baby until you're 10 years old, and you heard me say that every single day, by the time you're 10, you're hearing nothing else, are you? That's all you're hearing. You're not getting another opinion. Therefore, you start to believe it. And that's what he did. He used propaganda to escalate this persecution of the Jews. And he exaggerated some stereotypes that people had made about them in the past. He often portrayed Jews in his posters as being unattractive, often nasty, nearly always about grabbing power or grabbing money. So if we have a look at the two pictures I've got here, on the one side, this is a poster that was produced at the time, and we see the Jewish man. He's not portrayed as being particularly, healthy and attractive. He's got a bit of a hunchback. He's holding money. He's grabbing onto the money. Remember where this came from? Because the Pope in early history said that Christians couldn't lend money, so it fell to the Jews to often become money lenders, which has then created this stereotype, this idea that all Jews grab money where they can. And this poster here, we've got the Jew portrayed as an octopus with his tentacles all around the world, trying to grab onto as much power as possible. Okay, so these are just two examples, and there are numerous other examples where they used these posters to present Jewish people in a really negative way. Now, what's even worse is that children were even taught these things in school. We can see a little boy here who's pointing at the board, and they've got the Star of David, which is the symbol often associated with the Jewish people. We've got some symbols as well to talk about some stereotypes, so some negative ideas about Jewish people, and they're discussing it in the classroom. They also used in children's maths textbooks, they would make problems, math problems, like your problems are today. You might read a problem saying, I don't know, Alice and Jade went to the shop and they bought 7 oranges. If they lost 3 on the way home, how many have they got left? Well, in Germany, the textbook would read anti-Semitic messages in school textbooks. For example, a plane is carrying 3 bombs to Warsaw because the city is full of Jews. How much petrol will it need to get there if they use 4 gallons of petrol a meter, or whatever the question is? So some really nasty messages given to children in schools. And through these methods, Hitler is able to start changing people's opinion and getting them on his side. Now, that is how such a horrible thing was able to happen. Imagine if from the very first time you went to school, you were taught that a group of people were evil and bad and a danger to society. After listening to that message from everybody around you, from your teachers, from your parents, from your friends, on the news, in magazines, on social media, if it was everywhere, you would believe it and you would start to think it was true. Okay, and that's how Hitler managed to change a whole country's opinion and get them on his side with this. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you a timeline of what it would be like to live in Germany if you were Jewish. So we're going to start in the 1930s, and I'm going to give you this broad overview of what changed and how life became much more restrictive. So that word means lots of things were closed off. They weren't allowed to do things. Lots of opportunities were taken away from them. How it became more restrictive over about a 7-year period from 1933 to 1940. And then a couple of these events I'm going to go into detail and make its own video on a bit later to show you more detail of what happened. Okay, so if you were Jewish living in Germany, the first that you kind of noticed that there was some persecution, so things were changing for you, was in 1933. And in 1933, we had the one-day boycott. Now, this was where Germans were told to boycott Jewish shops. They were not allowed to go into Jewish shops and businesses. So Nazi soldiers would stand outside the doors of Jewish shops and businesses and would say, don't come in, go somewhere else for today. Now, this only lasted for 1 day. So that was really positive, and that's a good thing at the moment. But the fact it happened at all shows that Germany is starting to shift a little bit. And it isn't actually, the Jewish people were a specific, distinguished, separate group now that were being targeted, even if in small things like this. Okay, the next major thing that happened was that in May 1935, it was forbidden to join the army if you were Jewish. This was then taken even further in September with the release of the Nuremberg Laws. Now, these were a set of laws that banned marriages between Jews and non-Jews. So if you were Jewish, you are now no longer allowed to marry someone that wasn't Jewish. And it declared that Jews were no longer true German citizens. So they'd had their German citizenship stripped from them just because they were Jewish. They now were effectively aliens, which is what we call somebody who doesn't have a country of origin. So they've lost their kind of right to be German. This was a really significant moment when Jewish people realised that it was just getting worse and worse for them, and that actually the future didn't look so bright in Germany anymore. Okay, so the banning from professions happened in 1936. So remember, in 1935, they weren't allowed to join the army. And now in 1936, they're barred from professions such as teachers, doctors, and lawyers. They're not allowed to be any of these jobs, significantly, preventing some people from continuing with their careers, things like that. Right, 1938 is when it starts to become obvious for Jews living in Germany that it's no longer safe. Up until this point, most of what's been happening to them has been taking away their rights and their privileges and, you know, significantly affecting their way of life. But in terms of their safety and their person, they haven't been particularly harmed. Well, in 1938, we have an event that we call Kristallnacht, which means the night of broken glass. On this night, Jewish shops and businesses are attacked. Jewish synagogues, remember that's what we call the Jewish churches or the Jewish religious building, are attacked by Nazi thugs. And the rule of law kind of disappears and no longer applies to Jewish people. 30,000 Jews are captured and sent to concentration camps, which are kind of work labor camps outside of the cities, and 91 Jews are killed on this night. Now, I'm going to do a whole video about this in particular, and we're going to run through the details of it, but this is what we call a turning point in the timeline of Jewish persecution in Germany, because this is the moment where their lives are actually threatened quite significantly. So after Kristallnacht, like I said, everything starts to change very quickly. And in 1939, we have a process that we call ghettoization. Now, this means that Jews were forcibly removed from their homes and taken to things that we call ghettos. Now, a ghetto is an area of the town which is often much lower quality, run down, and it was designated for Jews only. So they lived in small segments of the city, which was walled off, and they were effectively locked in and guarded. They couldn't get out. They had much lower food rations in there. Lots and lots of people starved to death. Conditions were really horrible, really awful conditions. And it was a really horrible place to live. Okay, and the final thing I'm going to mention in this timeline is this, and this was the concentration camps. So by 1940, we had the establishment of concentration camps. Now, these were camps where more and more Jews were sent to work, where many people died of exhaustion and starvation. Now, again, I'm going to do an in-depth discussion and lesson on what the concentration camps were. Behind me, this is a picture of probably the most famous concentration camp, Auschwitz Birkenau. Above the gate, it says Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. Although nobody was freed from Auschwitz. I'm not going to go into right now what happens with the concentration camps and how they evolve a little bit later on in the war, but I'm going to leave it there, I think, for now. So we've got our main timeline set from 1933, the one-day boycott, all the way up to 1940 with the concentration camps. Now, we do see, as I mentioned, a small evolution from that point onwards. We see a change from just working Jews to actually murdering and killing Jews, but I don't really want to go into that now. We'll save that for a later lesson. So for the moment, there's your kind of broad overview of how persecution in Germany increases and how Jews are treated in Germany itself.